He's gone. Okay. Wow, I can hear myself. We're going to start. Good afternoon, everybody. I know there is competition. There's another session going on, also very interesting, but we're going to make sure that you made the right choice and that you'll find this conversation relevant for the rest of Bruegel's annual meeting, because it basically sets up the scene, although late in the day, as to what's going on in the world. So this is, of course, beautiful Europe. We know we are trying to decarbonize. We're trying to do so many things, but the world is big out there. And this session is really about that. We're going to focus on two topics, basically strategic competition, China, the US. But as it so happens, and we Europeans should realize, there's other forces out there. We have India right there. I can't see Sanjay, but I'm sure he's listening to us, so I hope. Hi, Sanjay, how are you doing? India is trying to break this strategic competition by creating this multipolarity, and we Europeans should know about these efforts because it's so important for us. So that's part of what we're going to discuss in the context of fragmentation, which makes it so much harder, whether it's trade fragmentation, investment fragmentation, financial fragmentation, the potential debunking of the dollar, you name it. So that's what we're going to do today. I'm going to start right away with Shirley Lin. You can see all of everybody's CVs, etc. I'm not going to do that job. We don't have any time. I just want our audience to hear our speakers. And I'm going to start with Shirley on this idea of where is China in this game. And Shirley, maybe, I'm not going to introduce anybody, but just to say that Shirley is a Taiwanese and absolutely global, having lived in the US, worked in the US, in China, in Hong Kong. So I can't think of anybody who can really give us this sense of where is China in the global context. So Shirley, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's so great to be here with my fellow board members and council members, including Alicia and Sanjoy, who actually helped me found Taipei's first international think tank ever. And it is within this context that I come and speak here about China and the world, and of course, European relations with Asia and how China sees the changing world. I think as a start, I live in Taipei and Hong Kong and spend a lot of time in Washington, in Charlottesville and in Washington. And I think that the world's fragmentation, or here we call it de-risking, there we call it decoupling, but basically East Asia is at the front and center, and Taiwan like no other place, being hit by all of the rules that are changing very quickly. From this morning I flew in, yesterday morning I flew in from Hong Kong. I think from China's perspective, very simply, the world changed on them. And they of course have a very important narrative that the world is decoupling from them. And I think, of course, to set this straight, for the last 30 decades, which I've been active in China, of course, China had always operated in a different mindset. That China was exceptionally protected in a separate place. China was always separate from the world, while we thought we were globalizing with not only economic relations, but also with value change. And I think the disappointment in Washington and throughout Asia that things actually did not converge economically and value-wise has really put us in a very tough position. But it's been very successful, in short, from my point of view, in terms of the decoupling strategy. I think from China's viewpoint, if you watch CCTV and understand the perspective, of course, it's been very difficult, especially on the technology front. And I want to hone in on that for just a few seconds. I think that from China, the perspective, of course, is with all the technological decoupling, China's GDP will be impacted on the short term, at least 1%. But over the long term, there are many, many forecasts, and it will be surely impacted far more than the short-term impact. What does that really mean for things like Made in China 2025 and trying to basically support national champion? I think this is a question for everybody in Europe and for Asia to think carefully about. Because as we are living in this world where rules are changing very quickly, I think while China believes that, of course, they are on the right path to help especially Latin America and Africa and Southeast Asia, to help the South, if you will, to bring about actually more prosperity and poverty alleviation. The simple matter is when values and interests conflict, there's a lot to think through. And I think that if you look at the numbers, U.S.-China trade in the first half of this year, import from China to the United States is at all-time low, only second to 2003, 2 years after China acceded to the WTO. This is the lowest ever. So in terms of trade, there's real impact. And if you fast forward to where I spend quite a lot of time the past year in Taiwan, Taiwan is at the forefront of this walking the tightrope. So Taiwan, while it has only invested $5 billion in China, in the past, basically China was the #1 destination. But just like in the US, where of course that investment to China is now dramatically declined, Taiwan has traditionally invested in technology in China. Over half of its investment is in China, is focused on the information communication technology sector. Although it's declined dramatically, trade surplus is at an all-time high with China. Two-way trade with China in 2021 was an all-time high. And yet investment is dropping to a level that's never seen before. So what that really means is while long-term investments are not being put in China, the rest of Europe and Asia really still depends on China for many, many of its most important products, especially those that are consumer-oriented or in terms of AI and EV market. I think this situation in Taiwan, of course, is most highlighted by the semiconductor industry, and I'd love to talk about it later. But I think that the fact is for the semiconductor industry to completely be separated from China is going to take time, and at the same time, China is catching up on legacy chips very, very quickly in a scale like never before. So in many ways, the policy that we are espousing to make sure that China does not have the most advanced technology could lead to a short-term reset where China is catching up with more subsidy and more ability to dominate the market, especially for Asian countries. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Shirley. So there you go. This is a picture of China suffering somewhat from this decoupling, de-risking, but in a way accelerating, if I hear you correctly, they're moving up the ladder. So on that note, we're going to hear from Brad about the US. How does the US envisage the world? You have China, right? I mean, not necessarily, but at least hearing from China. But bear in mind that, you know, Senju is listening, and Guntram too. So this is the world for you now.
Well, thank you. I thought I would make 3 or 4 observations about U.S. International economic policy in a world that, at least in Washington, is very much framed around Sino-American strategic competition. If I succeed, I'll have provoked you a little bit, but I won't have outraged you entirely. The first observation is that, you know, starting probably with President Trump, but continuing under President Biden, the U.S. has more or less, I think, reached a consensus that it doesn't want to interact with all of the world's great economic powers on equal terms. Most notably, it doesn't want to interact with China on the same terms that it interacts with the other large global economies. President Trump very obviously put tariffs up on China. He threatened tariffs on pretty much everyone else at various points in time, but the decisive shift in tariffs came only with respect to China. That has had some impact on bilateral trade. I would also note that it has massively encouraged the U.S. to import Chinese components that are assembled in Southeast Asia, so the global impact isn't as obvious. President Biden, with the Inflation Reduction Act, also embraced an economic policy system using different tools, subsidies, that did not treat all great economic powers alike. Now, Senator Manchin probably made the Inflation Reduction Act a little bit more restrictive towards Europe, than the Biden administration would have liked. But the thesis underlying the Inflation Reduction Act is that subsidies for clean technology coming from the US should not be used to build a clean tech industry in China. When you think about this, this is actually a fairly profound challenge to certain precepts that have been dominant in international economic policy making up until now. My colleague Peter Harrell, who used to work with me at the NSC and is a good friend, has said that from the US point of view, the problem with the WTO is that it requires the US to treat Germany and Europe and India equally with China. The US, in my view, no longer really believes in the principle of non-discrimination across different members of the WTO. Second observation, with all these changes, the Biden administration is, at least in my view, now looking to stabilize both strategic and economic relations with China. The thesis that the Biden administration came into power with was as follows. The US needs to start investing in its own infrastructure. The US needs to start investing more in its own industry. The US needs to invest more in strengthening its traditional alliances. But after it has made those investments, the US should be able to have a new, renewed dialogue with China from a position of strength. I think the Biden administration, and others may challenge this assessment, believes that it has achieved that position of relative strength and can now seek to stabilize relations and let some of these policy initiatives play out. I would submit that over the past 6 months, the Biden administration has arguably been more keen on a dialogue with China than China seems to be on a dialogue with the United States. Certainly there's a hope that President Xi visits San Francisco this fall. Third observation, there's another political party in the United States. It's not the political party I belong to, obviously, or have worked for, but it is instructive, I think, that the criticism coming from the Republican Party of what is, by any measure, a fairly significant reorientation in US international economic policy is that it doesn't go far enough. The current bid and offer between Republican candidates for the presidency, as opposed to Republicans elected in the Senate, on policy, international economic policy towards China and the world, starts with withdrawing US WTO accession from China and putting China back on the Smoot-Hawley tariff schedule, which I think, by the way, was probably constructed before there was something called a cell phone. And I'm not actually clear what the tariff would be on an iPhone, so it's a pretty big step, probably one that's unimplementable. But former President Trump's proposal is even further. It's withdraw permanent trading nation status with China and do a 10% tariff on everyone, and maybe move it up if countries revalue their currency in a way the US doesn't like. So the political discourse in the US has shifted quite far, but there is a desire, I think, at least on the part of the Biden administration.
Sorry. Maybe you need to hold it, sorry, for people to hear you.
At least on the part of the Biden administration, to see if the impact of the various measures that have been introduced. I left out the measures to strengthen technological defenses and economic defenses that also clearly were part of the strategy. Last two quick thoughts. This is actually a bit of a challenge for Europe. Setting aside Donald Trump, the Inflation Reduction Act's approach to supporting clean technology was not the European approach to supporting clean technology. It was fundamentally about subsidies. And there is a perception in Europe, a perception that I don't share, that Europe lacks the fiscal capacity to match the United States. Same argument can be made towards China's approach to supporting clean technology, which in a different way was fiscal intensive, even if it used the state commercial bank's balance sheet. But to be really provocative, there's another impediment or challenge to European economic policy making, which is that Europe's clear belief in holding to WTO principles in a world that where the other two big powers don't really hold to them, limits in some ways its opportunities for cooperation with the United States. The easiest deal after the Inflation Reduction Act between Europe and the US was a Buy Europe provision on European electric vehicle subsidies that would be reciprocated through reciprocal access by Europeans and Americans to each other's subsidies and leave China out in the cold. There's a similar deal that could be done on green steel, but that would involve accepting a US border adjustment without a domestic US carbon price. Thanks.
Wow. Okay, so because this is a European audience, I'm sure that we're all like, okay, I want a Q&A as soon as possible. So between the Q&A and us, there is Sanjay, who is going to talk about India now, and then we move to Guntrama on Europe. So Sanjay, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Alicia. We were excellent expositions from both Shirley and Brad, who put forward what they think of China and the US. We are talking about, the kind of the fragmentation which you're witnessing in the world today. And if you start talking about fragmentation, I think there are the kind of divides which we are seeing in the world, the geopolitical divides, where this is all arising from. Yes, you have the Iron Curtain back. It is the cleavage we thought it disappeared with the fall of the wall dividing Berlin, but obviously it was not. And the second thing which has resulted from this is that our very connectivity itself has become a weapon of war. Second is, Brad has spoken about it great length. The US focus is on China, China, China. That everything is, whether it is party A or party B, whether it is red or it is blue, this is going to be about China and nothing else. And the rest is, okay, a sideshow, which yes, something will happen, but the US is going to be China focused for the next few years. The problem is that, we're creating a world in which geopolitics and economics seem to be inhabiting two completely parallel universes. Trade still seems robust, trade seems to be growing. There's a lot of trade happening across the bamboo curtain, if not across the iron curtain. But yes, the point is that the supply chains which we've configured in the last 30 years have got everyone's interests so deeply entangled. Europe and China, US and China, ASEAN and China. A lot of countries have got so deeply integrated with each other that it's becoming extremely difficult to say where one country's interests end and the other ones begin. And mind you, these are not just when we say we will do this. Who is this we? There are lots of stakeholders involved in the game. There are lots of financial players, there are lots of corporate houses, there is big money involved, and the interests are extremely intertwined. So yes, this is a goal which has been set out. Getting there is going to be a long and difficult process. And in this long and difficult process, the way things are happening, you can see that there are rifts arising between allies itself. The IRA has, yes, raised certain apprehension in Europe. The IRA has also raised certain apprehensions in East Asia, in Japan, in Korea, as to what the US is doing. It has got so China focused. Now, caught in between, these two conflicts, are nations, middle class, beleaguered, emerging economies that, given a choice, have no interest in engaging in geopolitical competition, much less playing ball with any revisionist powers keen to overturn the existing global order. And these are actually small countries that have depended most upon global multilateral institutions to manage potential conflicts and smooth the impact of trade wars, great power rivalries, and so on and so forth. They were very suspicious of the WTO to begin with. Eventually, they got persuaded by this great globalization project, which seemed to have ended in 2008. So there is a reason why I think the divide which more attention needs to be focused on is not the divide between the East and the West, or the divide across the bamboo curtain between China and the US. The divide which is really going to matter for the future of this very fragmented world at this point of view, or point of time, is the divide which has re-emerged between the North and the South. Yeah. And it is this divide which needs, I think, over the next few years, it will be up to Europe and the US to actually woo back the global south. Now, what is the role of India? India in this situation, see, India by financial year 28 sees itself as becoming the third largest economy in the world. It is not really then even now part of the global south. But where India figures, and we've been seeing its actions during the G20 as well as during the BRICS, India hopes to become the bridge nation between, in this future world which you're moving into. This is going to be a long process. It is going to be a difficult process. This is not going to happen overnight, this reconfiguration which we are talking about. But it needs a concerted, combined effort. It needs far more consultation between the powers that think on similar lines. That consultation sometimes is not happening. This is not the kind of consultation which, for example, took place after the economic crisis of 2008, when people got together. The central banks had a focused attention on what countries should be doing to weather the effects. It worked in places, it did not work in places, but at least the effort was there. Today, there seems to be a lack of effort. So how do we kind of reinvent this new, that is what we're really discussing about, this new kind of, not just it is not multilateralism, which is a completely plurilateral world in which different countries, on the one hand, countries in the global south, are actually doing everybody. Some are part of the SCO, they're also part of organizations like the BRICS, and then you have the G20. Yes, these are divided houses, but many times it is better to debate in a divided house than reach consensus in an echo chamber. So that is where organizations like the G7 sometimes do become echo chambers where they keep on repeating the same things. They need some fresh air, fresh interactions with other countries who are actually very worried. They need to be taken into confidence. We need to have something which gives them hope after a time where they've been battered by, look at the way everything has been weaponized. The global financial system has been weaponized, food, fertilizer, energy, everything has been weaponized. So there are genuine apprehensions which are dividing the North and the South today, which need to be bridged. And that is where I think India does play a role.
Thank you, Sanjay. And I think this is very important for Europeans, most of us in the room, because basically what you are saying, and I'm sorry, but I'm going to be brutal here. So what you're saying is the US is basically shooting with, you've covered your eyes. I understand that at this point in time, you're not happy with China and the WTO, but some went in reluctantly, scarily, and they're now being, subject to this shooting, if I may say so, because in a way, by pointing inaccurately, if you see what I mean, and I'm talking about Trump, but we could go beyond, even IRA for many, yeah, as Sanjay just said about South Korea and Japan. You're in a way making everybody very nervous, and I'm sorry to be so, and we Europeans probably, and I'm going to leave it up to Guntram, but I guess in a way we have also this feeling. On the other hand though, Sanjay, it is amazing that India wants to bridge, but the point is this fragmentation, I'm sorry to say, I think I want to now rephrase Shirley, is not only being pushed by the US, it's even more complex. Because as Shirley said, China has been, in a way, ring-fencing its economy for so long. So it's like a double game, which for us, whether it's India or Europe, becomes so difficult. And I think that's where the US is reacting, but on the other hand, by reacting, you're in a way making it worse because it's two games on the same direction of fragmentation. So on that note, Guntram, what do we do about this world, we Europeans, in our naive, state of mind, maybe no more, but I guess a few years ago, certainly before the war started.
Well, thank you so much, Alicia, and thank you, everybody. It's great to be back. So let me really make 3 points. I think the first point is really that Europe continues to have an interest in supporting the multilateral order, the rules-based order, and I would reject the conjecture that WTO and international rules in trade do not matter anymore or do not help. They do. They do in many, many contexts. Much of global trade is still under MFN, and it is absolutely important to sustain this. And the European Union plays a very important role as the champion of supporting that multilateral order. And that is very much in the interest of what is called the Global South. And nowadays there's a big debate how to call it, but I mean basically emerging economies that are dependent on some rules to actually do trade, because without rules it's the carnivores, the big guys that call the shots, and that's actually a big problem. And by the way, multilateralism is not the same as multipolarity. I mean, let's really distinguish that. Multipolarity, I think we are far away from it. There are clearly 2, perhaps 3 big poles in terms of economic power. In terms of military power, there's really 2 big poles, right? And and this military power, as we know, matters increasingly and puts the EU in a very difficult situation, because we are looking on the military side, of course, very much to the US. We are completely dependent on the security guarantee that the US gives us, including on Ukraine. While, of course, when we look at the more economic side, we actually have big objections to the US approach to undermining the WTO and other institutions, perhaps more so than relative to China. So that's my first point. The second point, look, I think Europe cannot remain naive, so we have to prepare. We have to prepare for, I would say, worst case scenarios, and I don't think these worst case scenarios have a 0 probability. I mean, they have a positive probability, and I won't give you a number, but I think it's significant. And worst case meaning, a complete fragmentation of global trade in a context of a war in the Indo-Pacific, i.e. a war between China and the US, or something of that sort. So there are real risks out there for which we need to prepare. And my approach this, and I think the Commission's approach to this, and I will next week speak to EU finance ministers in Santiago de Compostela, and Nadia Calvino gave some hints this morning of the direction of travel. My approach is that, in principle, the de-risking instead of decoupling is the right one. Now, how do you de-risk, right? I mean, I think you need to de-risk very much data-driven, right? I mean, do stress tests, look at not sectors, look at which products really have excessive dependency on one supplier and address those. And if you have to address those, yes, you have to, at some stages, use some degree of industrial policy, but do it really data-driven. Don't just say, oh, in COVID, we realized that, I don't know, face masks are scarce, and therefore the entire health sector is something where we are overly dependent on China, so let's renationalize the entire health sector. I mean, that's a recipe for disaster, would be extremely costly and really not helpful. So a very targeted de-risking strategy with industrial policy on key products, I think makes sense. Now, you can debate the individual measures, and if you look at, for example, the CHIPS Act, I do buy the point in principle of building a European ecosystem for chips. Now, do I think that we need that much subsidies, and is the money really well spent, and do we do it the right way? I think that's a different debate. But the principle of building at least some ecosystem on high-end chips, I do think makes sense. My third point, and very quickly on this, is I would say give also the message, take economic security, which goes a bit beyond that, serious. What do I mean here? Well, I mean, we have a debate on export control mechanisms and outbound investment screening mechanisms. I actually do think the two make sense as a way of containing the spread of certain technologies, and there's a big debate on, how quickly the Chinese can replace and so on the chips, for example, but also others. But I do think, really looking at dual use goods, right, that have military applications. I mean, it's just that we have to take that serious, and we cannot, just ignore it. We have to do it in a European way, and that's a big issue because security is national, basically, right? And so if the Dutch government, under US pressure, decides not to export TSMC lithographic machines to build chips, well, I mean, then basically we have a problem if that is not backed up by European policy, because the underlying products for these TSML lithography machines come from Germany, right? It's size optics, right? So you want to prevent that sort of size optics sends the optics that then China uses to replicate the TSML. So you have to come together as Europeans. Therefore, we are actually going to propose and have proposed in a previous paper to have some sort of a European Economic Security Committee where national security expertise is basically pooled with European economic policy decision making, which I think is important. And conversely, the inbound investment screening, I do think that's actually also important when it comes to critical infrastructure. I mean, we need to take that serious, right? I mean, critical infrastructure is critical infrastructure, and we cannot just continue sort of accepting everything that comes in without, critically looking at it. There is some advancement in that, but I do think when it comes to hard security, I mean, basically we have to wake up and become tougher in our decision making. So these are my quick 3 points.
Thank you, Guntram. I'm just going to make a couple of points, and I think my questions, like double questions to this panel, won't be any better than anybody else. Actually, probably not. So I'm going to open the floor immediately for Q&A, but I was thinking, Guntram, on your point, that we Europeans, I heard this morning from somebody in the audience, that we just follow the US. We just, we are vassals of the US. You may not agree. Yes, you wish. But, this is kind of what you hear in everywhere in Asia, yeah? Surely it's like, but, in a way, I feel, wow, India actually has stopped probably many more investments from China, whether it's in software, whether it's in critical infrastructure, you name it, and nobody's telling India you're following the US. So we have an issue here in Europe because, in a way, we can't make a point. We can't make our point why we do certain things. I mean, de-risking started in Europe, the concept, and somehow in Asia, everybody thinks it started in the US. Of course, it's a different concept, and I'm not saying that for once the US is following on Europe's policy messages, but it is interesting that we can't somehow make a point. This is why we need this. We have decarbonization going on. We're too dependent. I mean, it's like a very basic argument why we're doing this. I would even say it's not about China. It's say Japan were selling 89% of solar panels to Europe. Somebody would say, wait a minute, this is too much, whether it's Japan, the US, or anybody else. So I have a problem with the fact that we can't actually communicate why we need certain things. And I have to say India seems to be more successful in as far as nobody's telling India, you're doing this on behalf of somebody else. And this might be related to our, unfortunately, institutional structure, as you said. There's so many things we can't actually do on a centralized basis. But that was just my comment on Guntram, that I feel like it's so hard to be Guntram in this panel, meaning it's so hard to be Europe. Shirley, go ahead, sorry.
Alicia, I thought it was very interesting what Guntram said. I wanted to add a couple of points to that. One is, since we're in Europe, every time I come, and yesterday I spent the day with Alicia in Paris, I feel very strongly that Europe is in a position where actually issue work, because in Europe, every country is the same. This is the basic principle, right? The European project. And so why is it that Europe is not working actually with Asian countries that are very aligned? ASML working with TSMC, they're all basically in this tightrope where they have to figure out how to continue to run their business, promote technological innovation that better all of our world, while following the US footstep in trying to ring fence, basically, and trying to make sure that it doesn't leak into dual-use technology. So that's the first point. I think Europe trying to work with what we call middle powers in Asia is very important because we can't wake up every day, and this is why we started Center for Asia Pacific Resilience and Innovation. We can't wake up in Asia every day and say, should I call Washington or should I call Beijing? That is just wrong. And today's world tells us that is what is happening. We cannot rely on the superpowers as they're trying to figure out their own interest. And second, on basically what Sanjoy said, I think it's very important. India actually points out there is another way. With Belt and Road Initiative, we all know. In Southeast Asia, it's different in Europe. Bulgaria can take one of the questions said, Serbia takes more Chinese money than anywhere else. I just have to remind the European audience, European trade and investment with China continues very strong. And this is all of a problem that we have, but Europe is under no illusion that China will change Europe to be Chinese. It's not possible. Never. And yet, Southeast Asia, I think there's a real chance. Societal resilience is very important, and in its backyard, China is very influential in bringing its alternative way of thinking about the world order to all of Asia. Now, South Korea, Taiwan, and Japan, it's not really possible. First is because they are, like OECD countries, they are high income, and they have other issues to deal with, like depopulation and inequality. But Southeast Asia presents a place where they need to find a model. And I think India, going on its own course, without the way that China is presenting itself in terms of value and interest to Southeast Asia, is highly instructive for the rest of the world. And I think it's possibly the most important experiment today that will face Europe in terms of whether the values we see in Europe and the United States actually are, quote, universal values. That is something that if you say that in Asia, it's a lightning rod. People are like, is it really universal? You know, the whataboutism that you get from listening to it. I think that Asia finally needs to work together as a region to deal with this China issue as a region, rather than being picked off. And this is where I think working with Europe, United States, India is very important.
Thank you, Shirley. So we're going to open up to questions. We have a couple of questions. I'm going to start with those in the room. Could you, yes, identify yourself and please get a mic over there.
Thank you. Sinan Ülgen, I'm with Carnegie Europe in Brussels and EDAM in Istanbul. I just want to follow up a bit on one of the points that Güntram has made. I listened to Richard Baldwin this morning as well. And I think we are a bit too complacent regarding the dangers on the multilateral system. The fact that there are these two drivers, climate and geopolitical considerations, our assumption are that ultimately the WTO will adjust. This is, in essence, a challenge to the core rules of the WTO, MFN, national treatment, special and differentiated treatment. But we somehow believe that ultimately the WTO membership will understand this and adjust. I think this is too much of a Eurocentric or rather Western-centric viewpoint. We don't fully digest, we don't fully perhaps acknowledge the reaction to this in the global south. And one example that I particularly fear is CBM. Once CBM starts to bite, I'm afraid that the type of role that this will generate within WTO, even we make it, CBM compatible with MFN and national treatment, there will still be issues regarding special and differential treatment. So my question to the panel is really, how do we make sure, as the EU, as the West more broadly, to get buy-in from the global south regarding the changes to the fundamental principles of the WTO if we are going to safeguard the multilateral system?
Thank you. So, Güntram.
I mean, very, very quickly, I mean, the WTO issue, I think, is a very important one, and supporting the WTO is a central pillar of Europe. Now, having said that, we have a new Director General or Secretary General of the WTO, Ngozi, and I actually had the opportunity to see her on Monday when she visited Berlin. And of course, the point is that the Global South is increasingly playing a role and wants to have a role and wants to shape that institution. And in my view, there is legitimacy to that claim. And I think the Europeans are relatively open in engaging into that conversation. I think, and again, let me make the point, without the WTO, many countries in the global south would have a much harder time doing actually global trade, right? So let's not, let's value this WTO. There's this big debate about the dispute settlement system, of course, and the arbitrage, the court of the dispute settlement court, and the US is basically not there anymore, making it ineffective. But there's this replacement, right, which is sort of outside of the WTO, but it seems to work, and there have been cases actually already, and China is actually part of it, which is quite interesting. So, I do think we will have to exercise some flexibility here, and Europe should be rather supportive of these claims. And frankly speaking, I think at some stage the US needs to think seriously about what does it mean if you're permanently blocking it. I think it actually does create significant problems.
Thank you. I think there was a question right beside. Yeah.
Jacob Kierkegaard from the Peterson Institute and GMF. I guess this is a question for the whole panel. We talk a lot about global competition and reshaping the order and sort of trying to redirect with industrial policies, etc. But all of this it's pretty expensive. And right now we're looking at a situation where the federal government fiscal deficit this year is projected to be $2 trillion at a time of near full employment and end of cycle. I would venture that's not normal. Meanwhile, obviously, whatever you think about the central government in Beijing's fiscal situation, once you add in local governments and local government financing vehicles and implicit guarantees for various wealth management products, etc., China also starts to look like, at least domestically, a very leveraged economy. And obviously in Europe, we love to talk about fiscal rules at the EU level, as Guntram knows very well, at the national level as well. But my question really is to you, how does global competition and these attempts to reshape the global order look in a world where fiscal policies increasingly become a constraint?
Yeah, I think this question is very relevant because it's like we have this public good. There are many questions on this, on climate change. We all want to decarbonize and help I don't think I want to mention the word Global South for obvious reasons, help others decarbonize. And I know Sanjay surely understands, how constraining it is to be described by somebody else as to who you are. But on that point, I think the problem here is that knowing that this was already very expensive and we had the panel right before, why are we making it more expensive? Why are we just increasing the cost of something we all need to do? Because that's what we're doing, in a way. So, I wonder whether we couldn't find a different solution, more cooperative solution, just tech transfer, yeah? Everybody, not only the US, frankly, I would disagree with Baldwin, I'm sorry to say that, now he's not there. I think China has the technology and basically exports it out. It's straight surplus, it's basically green tech. And basically waits to install more capacity, so it basically exports 2/3 of that, and keeps only 1/3, and when the prices will go down. So the opposite of the US, in a way. They're subsidizing it, surely, to gain market share. But the point is, to export to us, we're paying the price, yeah, aren't we? And then, when prices are lower, they will just reinstall the capacity. But why I'm saying all of this is because, in a way, what to your question is, we are making our lives so difficult, yeah? China's public debt is 100% of GDP. Why are we doing this? Why are we not just finding the cheapest solution to all of us decarbonize at the same time, let it be done. Is it because of geopolitical competition or, strategy? Is it, why are we not? And then, frankly, the others, including, would be quite much happier with us by instilling this sense of confidence that we are all on the same boat. So I don't know. I just said this for the whole panel, but I'm looking at Brad.
So I'll answer that. I think fundamentally, the U.S. chose an expensive route to decarbonize because of strategic competition.
Okay.
Just raising the price of carbon would have given an advantage, frankly, to Chinese producers who had a head start thanks to their own domestic subsidies. A second-tier consideration, maybe some people would say it's first tier, is building a political coalition that sustains green industrial policy in the U.S. We are a fossil fuel balanced economy, probably a net exporter if you count LNG. Energy security has been achieved, climate security has not. And after the domestic political reaction to the China shock, I think it was a real shock, we can debate that, there was certainly a perception that the shock associated with the green transition should also not be a second China shock in all of its dimensions. But I think Jacob raises a profound and important question. We chose a fiscally more expensive path to decarbonize. We've ruled out taxes, carbon taxes, for now. Not clear that we can sustain that fiscally. Over time, it seems to me that it is impossible for the U.S. at least to have a fiscally financed green transition, investments in strategic military capabilities that the U.S. now believes are necessary to manage China's nuclear and naval buildup in the Pacific, and collect, I don't know what the exact number is, but something like 15% of GDP in taxes at the federal level. Mm-hmm. Ultimately, we in the United States, in my view, will eventually need to pay more in tax. Thankfully, there's some easy opportunities to collect tax. We don't tax a lot of bads like carbon, and we don't actually tax our companies that effectively. I've written exhaustively about how little U.S. tax revenue the U.S. collects from American pharmaceutical companies, which produce in Europe and actually pay tax in Europe. So we might get in a little tax competition there, but of the good kind. But fundamentally, Jacob, you're right. You cannot have a world of strategic competition and its cost and the current low level of U.S. taxation. I think that's one of the many things we see in the current fiscal numbers.
Yes. We're going to first, Shirley, give the floor to Sanjay. But Sanjay, beyond answering this question, thank you, Brad, I have one more for you. India wants to be a multilateral broker, but also focuses more on self-reliance. Will India's economy further open up or become more protectionist? So, both the previous question and this, if you may.
Thanks, Alicia. Let me first of all respond to something you tried to be saying. We are blaming US for the fragmentation. We are not. I'm not simply blaming US for the fragmentation. I'm not blaming for the reason that I don't think US any longer has that capacity to push in the direction of fragmentation. There are other fish in the pond doing it, and they are becoming very, very active geopolitical actors. So we must, first of all, when we talk of this whole question of multipolarity, yes, there are other poles emerging, and they are playing games also. So the fragmentation is as much ascribable to them as it is to any other country in the world. Second question is, of course, Jacob raised that very relevant question of capacity. Fiscal capacity is an issue. We keep talking of resilience, we keep talking of rebuilding supply chains. India talks of self-reliance, everyone talks of self-reliance. It's not just India talking of self-reliance. The whole world is talking self-reliance today. The problem which most countries in the global south today see is that developed countries, in the guise of resilience, what happens when they start pursuing policies driven by self-interest and blatant open protectionism? Because they have one fundamental political problem. They need to keep the jobs going at home. There are fiscal constraints, and then when they start looking at things like the CBM, they are whatever. The response then to the CBM is what? Have rents on carbon squatters and evict them from the carbon they've been squatting on? Should that be the response of the Global South? So there needs to be a conversation if you're talking about what kind of transition in terms of supply chain resilience, transition in terms of climate action. It's going to be a long and difficult transition. We cannot do it in the kind of silos we are doing it. And every country has its own path. It is not going to be the same pathway across every country. What is good for A, it is not going to be good for B. So we will need to be accommodative. And that is where, yes, countries like India do play a role. I think most countries in the Global South have far more confidence than if you look at the way the G20 has been going. See, India has been trying to focus attention away from issues about the East-West divide and focus on whether there's going to be a joint statement coming out on nuclear or something like that. That is not the priority. The priority is how do you reshape global financial institutions? How do you give the South a voice in global financial institutions to make these transitions possible, to make this kind of decoupling, building resilience possible in a way that is fair, and it is fair to the Global South. Now, that is going to be the big question which we need to confront.
Thank you, Sanjay. We are basically there on time, but we started late. So I'm going to have 1 minute. And just to remind the panel that there are questions on Africa. Actually, could India become an actor there, Sanjay? I think you are already. We have actually some research at Bruegel showing this India, basically, network, India becoming a real trade center, which is interesting. But having said that, you have that, Africa, then there's one, Guntram, on our neighborhood, and China, and there's quite a few others, but what I think we should do here to end this conversation is to have a minute each of what you think we Europeans, you Guntram, have it easy, but for others, should do in the light of what we just heard, Brad, you did scare us, so, now the other way around, put the European hat, tell us what to do in the light of what you said. So shall I start same order? So Shirley, I know you wanted to talk, so could you please?
I was going to respond to the last question, so I'll do 30 seconds of that, basically from China's perspective. I think deleveraging, of course, is what Xi Jinping is trying to do.
Yeah.
So there's no doubt. I mean, China's in it has a totally different structure. One of our colleagues at University of Virginia, Lan Xiaohuan at Fudan University, just wrote a book on public finance. It's so quickly, 5 million copies in Chinese, because nobody in China understands public finance. They don't know what their government is doing. They don't know how provincial governors decide things. They don't understand the debt situation. But what I want to say is long-term, China's problem is not deleveraging as we think about it in Europe or the United States. Long-term, it has the inability to boost domestic consumption. We see that after COVID, during COVID, and now. Second, population is declining. Before it gets rich, it's already depopulating. It's never happened in any large country in the history. Currently, youth unemployment is rampant. And jobs, whether you're a democracy or not, that's what you want. And so I think China has this big issue that is really separate, and it comes back to the question. So the second point you were asking about Europe, I just want to remind everybody, strategic, I keep hearing about sovereignty, strategic autonomy, economic resilience. It costs. It costs to have resilience. Resilience means redundancy. It means putting up multiple R&D centers, multiple supply chain lines, just in case you cannot rely on your principal provider, and who's going to pay for it? In the question that we just posed about fiscal policy, we are all going to have to pay for decarbonization. We're all going to have to pay for having more economic resilience. And so as we are squeezed, policymakers have to make the trade-off between one priority and another. And I think this is the issue with the world. We're also specialized. Who is going to sit there and say, let's make the painful trade-off and decide on where to go? And so we need innovative way of thinking, and that's what Europe can do.
Thank you, Shirley. Brad.
Well, I think the U.S. actually does, maybe not all of the U.S., because I'm not sure about President Trump, but I think most of the U.S. actually does see the world, at least the global economy, as a G3, and thinks Europe already has a central place at the table, and would actually like to see a stronger Europe, Europe with fiscal capacity, that can directly contribute to, let's say, a system of NATO EV subsidies that exclude China, more European defense capacity, greater artillery production in this continent, increased investments in a range of supply chain resilience. So I think a stronger Europe, in the classic sense, should be viewed in the US as in both Europe's interest and in the United States' interest. I think second, I think the US adopted the term de-risking because it's actually a more accurate description of what the US is trying to do than decoupling ever was. Our biggest company, the most valuable company on the US stock market exchange, produces 95% of its product in China. They're not decoupled. You can go through the US economy and say there are vast sectors that are not yet decoupled, that are certainly not decoupled, and where de-risking is only beginning. So I think my advice to Europe is to figure out what de-risking means, figure out the policies that go with it, figure out how to pay for them, figure out how narrow or how broad you want to be. Final recommendation for Europe, which is enormously self-serving. I fully agree we need to strengthen the multilateral system, the multilateral development institutions. I was shocked to look and read that the world has only contributed $20 billion over its history in paid-in capital to the World Bank. $20 billion is nothing. So I think Europe should put the US on the spot and argue boldly for doubling the MDB's paid-in capital and then levering it up using the huge quantities of SDRs that are sitting underutilized on the balance sheets of European central banks. Helps the global south, strengthens Europe's global role, challenges the US to match a bold European initiative.
Okay.
And there is, of course, a great paper, Brad, that you published on that in case one...
I want to leave the floor to Sanjay because I think he needs to swallow two things. The G3, I heard, India is soon going to contribute, actually maybe already, contribute, not of course GDP growth, more than the whole of the EU. So there you go. And secondly, this capital you want to put in the World Bank, I'm sure they would be very happy to put some and have more power in these global financial institutions, as Sanjay just said. So, Sanjay.
I think the way out for Europe, and not just Europe, both for US and Europe, is actually to work together in tandem once again and take the leadership they've always held. Today, they are being far too reactive. And they've been reacting to the actions of China most of the time. So when we start talking of the strategy they have in mind, yes, China has a globalization strategy. The globalization strategy is very well laid out in the BRI. And when they go into the BRI narrative, they talk about creating so many jobs, creating infrastructure, and that has a certain allure. Now, the counter to that, which has been the Indo-Pacific strategy, I think both the US and Europe need to work in tandem, get together. It is not a pure security strategy. It is not so much about security. Security happens, by the way. It's an offshoot of it. But the real Indo-Pacific strategy has to have strong economic fiscal legs to run on. That is where there's a lot missing. So work in consortium with the Global South and create a counter strategy, which then builds resilience in the Global South. That is what is required. And there, the US and Europe, yes, can play a very important role together.
Thank you, Sanjay. We didn't even mention the Global Gateway, which shows where we are. Thank you. Guntram, before they throw us out of the room.
Yeah, very quickly, three quick points. I mean, the first point is, of course, when you have a non-cooperative game and two players play Nash, then the tendency of the third player and all the others is also to play Nash. Now, we need to prevent that this becomes too wide. And that's why my point was, let's be as narrow as possible in this playing of Nash, meaning industrial policy. Let's use WTO instruments such as anti-subsidy, countervailing duties to limit this space as much as possible. Second, when you come to the green transformation, I mean, there's a great paper, Jacob, by your boss, Adam Posen, who basically argues, and I think he makes a very important point there, is the key is the rollout. right, of the green technology. It's not the production of the green technology itself. If I look at, and here I put on the German hat, if I look at what matters for the German industry now, it's not whether there will be a few jobs, and Niklas Poitier of Bruegel had a nice piece sort of showing that the job creation of IRA in the green space is extremely limited. The key for the German industry is not whether we will have a lot of wind energy. The key is, will we get cheap energy, right? I mean, cheap energy is the thing that matters. And so let's import all the renewable stuff that we have secure, under security vision, but let's have that cheap energy. So I think that's very, very important. Third point on the neighborhood. I mean, Europe needs to invest in its neighborhood. I think this needs to be increasingly requiring actual EU resources. I mean, if we think we can do this on a country-by-country basis, it's not going to happen. The amount of resources needed for Ukraine will be very substantial. We need, in my view, an EU debt instrument for that, as we need an EU debt instrument for certain other things, including defense investments, etc. But let's take that as a step for European integration. And I think Serbia is, I mean, Serbia, look, I mean, I don't want to sort of now sort of focus in too much on Serbia, but in Serbia we have a real political problem. I mean, and that needs to be dealt with very proactively. It requires resources, but it also requires quite a bit of political, I would say, heavy lifting here.
Thank you. So on that note, thank you so much for listening, and very, very sorry we're late. Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.